starts the Trent just past Rugeley at the Staffordshire Wildlife Trust headquarters at Wolseley Bridge, and it runs to Shardlow, where the Derwent comes into the Trent. It also includes the Tame from Hopwas to where it the confluence with the Trent at near Alderwas by the National Memorial Arboretum, and it also includes the Dove from Roaster through to its confluence with the Trent just by Stretton there. Oops, that button's not working. There is the map. Can you see that clearly? You can see there are 3 clusters of cultural heritage centres, really, and they are based around in the area to the north around Aston-on-Trent, that area, a central area around Burton, which is largely industrial heritage, and then to the south between sort of Elford and Fradley, Catholme, Alderwas, that area. The area to the north and south is largely prehistoric remains, and those central areas are the industrial heritage. We've divided our 2 cultural heritage projects into, these are our code numbers. That's Transforming Lives 04 and 03, 4 being the military heritage, and which is largely based around pillboxes actually, and then 3 is everything else from prehistory to post-industrial, sorry. The military side of it has been quite interesting. I'll come on to that in a moment actually, but that's been quite an interesting project for me, because I knew almost nothing about Second World War history, particularly in relation to the Trent Valley. And this is what it's all about, really. This is an image of a pillbox. Firstly, we decided that we would be recording and assessing the condition of the military heritage that's left in the Trent Valley. So that means that we were looking at the pillboxes to see what condition they were in, whether they were still in the stable condition, because it's what people don't realize about these is that they're not subject to any kind of legal protection. So the pillboxes, in fact, they were actively encouraged to be destroyed after the war. There's a story that may be apocryphal, that the government after World War II offered farmers £5 per pillbox that's on their land to destroy them. But farmers, being the canny people that they are, took the £5 and then decided that they would use them for pigsties or cattle sheds or nothing at all, and leave them exactly where they were, because they are built to a bulletproof standard, so that makes them very difficult to knock down, and as you can imagine, I'm sure. So we got this problem that we knew there were some 72 or 73 pillboxes in the project area that are unprotected by law, but have got a significance to our sort of shared past. So there were a number of suggestions as to what we do with them. Number 1 was to record what kind of condition they're in now, and that means visiting them all. And that often they're on private land, so we have to get permission from landowners, go to the site, and then get into the pillbox itself, which is very often not that easy, because they're quite overgrown with brambles, or they're in fairly remote places. And then we have to go inside and check what kind of condition they're in, whether they are suitable for the renovation purposes that we want to put them to, whether there's any damage to the concrete that they're made from. So yeah, that's just something else to say. They're made from a reinforced concrete. They're essentially a steel formwork with concrete poured over them into shuttering, which forms the shape that they're in, and then they have a reinforced concrete roof poured on the top. Inside, I don't know if you've ever been inside one. Inside they have a concrete blast wall, like a Y shape. So you go into the door and you immediately have to turn left or right, and that concrete blast wall then extends forward into the center of the pillbox, and that provides a kind of blast wall so that if bullets come in through the loophole windows, they can't ricochet around and kill all the occupants, that they'll do a minimal amount of damage, and that the mini fortress can carry on being a mini fortress. They're all along the Trent because, if I just skip back to the map slide here, they're based essentially wherever there's a river crossing, be that a rail bridge or a road bridge or a ford or even a shallow point. So it was assumed that there would be an invasion from the east, that the German military would be advancing from the east coast across towards the sort of the industrial heartland of the Midlands. So each city or town had its own defence around it, but also the military authorities at the time came up with a plan that they would defend natural sort of boundaries across, anywhere that would slow an advancing army across the countryside. So the rivers were an obvious obstacle to an advancing army. So at each crossing point, there has been a pillbox built that would slow down the enemy advance, and give time for reinforcements to gather, and then enclose the enemy and then hopefully neutralize them. So our plan, the plan we drew up originally, or the plan that was drawn up before my time originally, was to reuse and repurpose the pillboxes for wildlife, that bat hibernacular, bird hides, walkers' refuges, geocaching and interpretation. And one of the first things that I did when I came on to this team was to remove the bird hides and walkers' refuges ideas from that list. That meant that we had to modify our targets because, as with anything, where money's involved, a target has to be met for the spending of that money. So we had to revise our targets upwards for the others. And the reason I wanted to take out the walkers' refuges and bird hides is because I don't think that the people who came up with that plan had actually been inside a pillbox. Unfortunately, pillboxes get used for all sorts of things. And generally speaking, that could be the dumping of rubbish, all sorts of antisocial behaviour, and very often they're used as toilets. So they don't lend themselves that well to walkers' refuges. It was a nice idea, but one that we quickly rethought. This is some of the interpretation. This interpretation panel is at the National Memorial Arboretum. There is a pillbox that you can visit in safety. It's clean and tidy inside, and it gives you some idea of the conditions that soldiers may have had to fight in. Fortunately, of course, we were never invaded in the Second World War, and we didn't have to defend the River Trent or the River Dove or the Tame against an advancing enemy. And that's probably a really good thing, because they are very Spartan concrete buildings. There's no home comforts inside there whatsoever. They're not the kind of place you would want to spend any amount of time. This is the geocaching. I don't know if you know what geocaching is. Essentially, it's a kind of treasure hunt where you can go for a walk, visit a geocache site, and log the fact that you've been there on a website or in the notebook that's normally left with the geocache. We decided that we would put in some geocaches along the Trent Valley Way as it passes through our area, and we've installed 4 of these with these geocaches at Wolseley Bridge, Croxall Lakes, Branston Leys and at Shardlow. just to encourage people along the Trent Valley Way, and they can take a token. And if you, each one of those tokens, as you can see on the screen, they've got an individual number. You can log that on the website, and that also then links you back to the Transforming the Trent Valley website. So between us and the geocache people, we've made this a sort of a complementary exercise, if you like. We borrowed their expertise, and we provided these ammo tins that are also waterproof. The wildlife conversions. This is some photographs that you can see actually on the photograph of the red brick pillbox. That is in fairly poor condition. Most of the pillboxes are in reasonable shape. There's some damage to it internally to concrete, and there's quite often graffiti. But essentially they are quite solid structures. You can see that central picture there. That's when we were filming for Countryfile in November 2011. They wanted to come, and they'd heard we were converting some of the pillboxes to bat hibernacula, and they thought that would be an appropriate section of their program for remembrance, for their program nearest Remembrance Day in 2011. Pillboxes are actually, with them being in fairly remote conditions, they're often in very beautiful places as well. So you can walk along the river and it'd be really pretty, you know, or a nice place to go and just have a gentle afternoon's walk. These are the wildlife conversions. We did two types. One's for bat hibernacula, which is hopefully where bats will hibernate over winter, and the others were for wild bird nest sites. This is us converting. We converted 5 pillboxes on the Hanson's quarry site, although the quarry itself isn't anywhere near the river. Hanson's own a section of land up to the river between Walton Bailey Bridge and the National Memorial Arboretum. And we converted 5 of those, 3 for bat hibernacula and 2 for wild bird nest sites. And then we converted a further 2 last month for wild bird sites. They were at Branston Leys South, where it joins the Tucklezone Nature Reserve, and at Utoxeter, but opposite the footbridge that leads across from Doveridge on the River Dove. The most important thing you can do for wildlife is, and this is always the case whether this is a nature reserve, you know, for a wildlife nature reserve, or a pillbox, and that's keep people out. People and wildlife generally don't mix that well. So it's important when you convert in a pillbox that you put on a lockable steel-plated door with a cover for the padlock. We noticed the Environment Agency had made they'd had a project along the River Dove and Trent a few years ago, a bit north of our project area, and I went to visit a couple of their sites before we started work, just to see what I could learn from that. And what they hadn't done on one of theirs, their early ones, was to put a metal box over the padlock, which meant that immediately the padlock was broken off and people went inside and set fire to the hessian that had been hung up for the bats to roost in, and just generally damage and break things and convert it back to a sort of skip. These were done in March. As you can see, the temperature was quite cold, not quite as cold as it's been today, but it was, we had a week converting those 5, and it was pretty cold. The bat hibernacula, you might be able to see from these photographs. In the bat hibernacula, we brick up the loophole windows as well and leave a kind of letterbox slot for bats to crawl through. That prevents as much as you can. It prevents rats or whatever getting in there as well. Unfortunately, rats can pretty much get anywhere, so that means we have to raise the areas that the bats are going to potentially hibernate behind or roost in as high off the ground as we can within the confines of the pillbox itself. What we found was that straight away with the conversions we've done in March. Although it's difficult to see the slide, sorry, the image just there. I don't know if you can see my mouse going around. There is a tawny owl. This side, this pillbox, a wren moved in straight away and nested, and this one, very difficult to see, but there, because it was moving so fast, because we placed trail cameras inside, I ought to have said we placed trail cameras inside the conversions, and that is a bat just flying along there. Really difficult to capture with a trail camera. That's a, you know, as soon as you stop the image, it turns into kind of ghost bat. I'm just going to see if I can get this short video clip to work, and you might just be able to see there, a bat. Now, I thought at first that bat had flown in to hunt for moths inside the pillbox, but in actual fact, I think what it had done is probably roosted in that hessian that's hanging up there, and it was just stretching its wings and warming itself up before it went off to hunt for the evening. So although I don't think that bats have yet moved into our pillbox conversions for the winter, I do think that they were roosting in there over the summer and then flying out to hunt for the evening, which, considering that footage, please ignore the timestamp on that. That's where I'd not reset the set the trail cameras. They've moved in within a month of us doing that conversion, and that's how quickly wildlife starts to repopulate an area. Some wildlife, of course. Now then, this is our pillbox display. This is on tour at the moment. It's on tour in Staffordshire, around the county libraries at the moment, which its tour ends, I think, in January, and then we're hopefully going to move it into Derbyshire so that some of the Derbyshire libraries can have some of the experience to have a look at the pillbox display and get some idea of the experience that we've had in the conversions and why we're making those conversions, that kind of thing. As you can see, there's a model of the pillbox on the front. The top lifts up and you can see the Y-shaped blast wall inside. And then we move on to the second part of the project, the TL03, and this covers everything to post-industrial, not just industrialization. And this image that you can see is the East Prospect of Burton. This was drawn, I think, if I remember rightly, in certainly 18th century. I can't remember the year, maybe 1730, something like that. And you can see how this is from Scalpcliffe Hill. I did try and go up and get a photograph from Scalpcliffe Hill, looking across it so that we could compare and contrast the view now to the view then. But actually, Scalpcliffe Hill is covered all over with very mature trees. So it's impossible to see out across the valley, which is a shame. So maybe we'll be able to go up there with a drone and get a similar-ish kind of shot just to compare. So one of the first parts of the project that I wanted to do was have a look for a Roman road, the Via Divana. This was proposed to have run from Colchester across country through Cambridgeshire to Leicester, and then on from Leicester across country through either Rochester or Uttoxeter, and then on to Chester. This was first, a series of alignments were first noted from aerial photography and map reading along parish boundaries and field boundaries by Peter Liddell, who was in 1993, he was the county archaeologist for Leicestershire, and he had an interest in the road as it ran through Leicester and Leicestershire, and then it crosses the boundary into Derbyshire, then it runs along the parish boundary between, Walton on Trent and Drakelow, and crosses the River Trent, and then runs across and meets the Ricknell Street, which is where the A38 now runs, and then continues across Staffordshire into Cheshire. So I thought we'd have an opportunity to have a look at that road, hopefully. Oh, excuse me, I can't get my presentation to move on. There we go. We were fortunate in that there were, in a way, if you can call it fortunate, there was some development, housing development in Moira in northwest Leicestershire in 1998. They knew that the road was proposed to run across the area, and they put this trench in the photo on the right there, and discovered that the remains of a Roman road were indeed there. You can see the blocks and the central gravel area and the sort of outer ditch in the foreground of the picture. And then the image on the left is a raised bank that follows the line of the proposed Roman road. I mean, it's difficult to say with a raised bank. It could be a farm track, but it's certainly on the correct alignment. So fingers crossed that one day we'll be able to have a proper look at that. That's in Derby, further into Derbyshire than the project boundary allows me to work, but at some point we will hopefully be able to get in there. So we had the opportunity on the west bank of the River Trent, that is, to have a look using geophysics. Again, this was in March as well, the end of March, and we went to see if we could find the road using electrical resistivity. A group of volunteers on a very cold Saturday in March. The problem with Roman roads is even where you know where they are, without putting a spade in the ground, it's very difficult to find. And although Roman roads were used by the time of the Tudor period, when parishes became responsible for the upkeep of their own roads and bridges, the parish tended to find a local source of building material to repair their own roads, and very often that could be in a disused section of Roman road. So after we'd done all that, spent the day doing the geophysics team leader said, yeah, that he'd been on roads where they knew there was a Roman road and it was still invisible to the geophysics. So unfortunately, we weren't able to definitely say whether the road ran. You can see these two yellow lines on this image show where we put our pseudo sections. Pseudo sections essentially an electrical resistivity cut down into the earth, to see if you can see a section across it. It might be easier to explain it from the results. So this was our two results. The blue color is low resistivity and the red color is higher resistivity. Now, I think it's possible that we did find the two boundary ditches and the raised section of the road, but we weren't able to say without putting a physical trench into the ground whether or not we'd definitely found the route of the road. I think there's a possibility that we did. So it's a probable success, but not one we can properly chalk up just yet. The next set of geophysics we did was on, so if I just see if I can show you this image here. This is the line of the Via Divana. At the same time, when Peter Liddell was chasing his road, what he noticed from aerial photography was this curved section of a double, what appeared to be a double ditch here. And Peter interpreted that as a potential Roman marching fort. Even on the aerial photography, I don't know if you can see, the line continues across the next field here as a double ditch line. So we thought we would have a good chance of finding something with the geophysics. This photo, incidentally, was taken in 1983 by a chap called Jim Pickering. Jim, I never met him. He was a Spitfire pilot in the war, and then he spent a lot of the post-war years taking aerial photographs across the country. So that there are a lot of aerial photos that are attributable to Jim. I don't know if you can just see on this photograph, there's a pylon in the middle of the field, which doesn't bode well for doing any kind of geophysics because of the interference. But then there's also another sort of rectilinear feature here that we didn't have time yet. We haven't had time yet to investigate. It's outside the sort of scope of the project that we set ourselves, which was to find potentially this Roman fort on the Walton-Drakelow boundary. We had a weekend of geophysics. This is a couple of photographs from that weekend. This is using the geophysics type that you may have seen if you ever used to watch Time Team or that kind of thing. Essentially, two probes on a half-meter wide measured stand connected to some surveying equipment, which you then lay out a grid 20 by 20 meters and take a measurement at every meter along the grid at meter wide spaced points. So if I've explained that properly, you can see on this image here, there are some, that's actually a washing line laid out between 2 points, 20 meters long, a meter apart, and then you take another meter every measurement. That weekend, we took 10,000 individual measurements across as much of the site as we had the time to measure. So we had to quite carefully target where we were doing that survey. We didn't have we knew we didn't have the time to cover the whole of the 2 fields, so we were quite careful about where we did that. Now, I don't know if you can see from this, so the black and white areas are the geophysics areas that we measured or surveyed. And here, I don't know if you can see, this is quite clearly the double ditch line. There appears to be another ditch inside there, and also just as it gets to the river, there's a return. So what we quickly realized, this red line, I ought to say, that's the proposed line of the Via Divina Roman road. What we realized that the fort, if such it is, does not align on the Roman road. And equally, because of the bend in here, we knew that we'd lost part of the fort site into the river. So quite clearly, it doesn't align on the river either. The river has moved in the last almost 2,000 years since this fort was built. And that's apparent also in any LiDAR information that you look at. LiDAR is a method of looking at the ground using a laser that measures the sort of topography, if you like. It doesn't really look into the ground, but it looks at the sort of humps and bumps and ups and downs of the ground itself. And what we realized was across here, this is where the geophysics from the last slide was shown on a 3-dimensional map of the area. This is the line of the River Trent as it is now. In the LiDAR, you can see a paleo channel of the river, an ancient river channel just here, and a further one along here somewhere. But the Roman road aligns on this paleo channel. And I think what this was doing, this fort here was designed to defend against the more aggressive Coritani tribe on this side of the river, against the Roman forces that had advanced with a forward line along the River Trent. These were some of the finds that we picked up. We didn't do any proper field walking, but we didn't have time. And anyway, there was some secondary growth and stubble on the field, so it was very difficult to do any proper field walking. But these finds were picked up from the fort site and in the field immediately next to it. You can see here there are 4 pieces of Roman greyware, and then this is a piece of Samian ware, a second piece of Samian ware that was recovered at the same time. The greyware is a kind of everyday use type of material. It's fairly coarse, but used practically, whereas Samian at this time, so we're talking probably around about 48 to 50 AD, something like that. This was imported from Gaul at the time, and this is a better quality tableware for now. What I ought to say is this does not prove a Roman fort. This demonstrates that there was Roman activity in the area at that time, or Romano-British activity in the area at that time, that the local Iron Age or late Iron Age Celtic tribes had taken on perhaps some Roman ideas and Roman ways of living, and that it's potentially this. What I'm saying is this is doesn't prove the fault, but it's kind of nice corroborating evidence that something was going on there in that period. So we as yet, what I ought to say before I leave this about the fort is that we went back there this week and did another 2 pseudo sections, cuts into the ground over the line of those double ditches, with the hope that we'll be able to look at them and see what depth of archaeology survives, and hopefully we'll be able to then at some point we perhaps take ground penetrating radar and have a look at it in 3 dimensions, and then possibly in the future we'll do an archaeological dig over the ditches themselves and see if we can, from the bottom of the ditch, from the ditch fill itself, find any kind of definite dating evidence. Because at the moment we've got a double ditched rectilinear enclosure that's possibly or probably a Roman marching camp, so it may not have even been used for more than, certainly not a decade. And then hopefully we'll be able to find some kind of evidence that you know, Romans or the Roman military were in the area at that point and built this fort. So this is what we intend to do, hopefully, is locate the east gate of the fort, because the west gate has been lost to the river. The south gate has been lost to a, it just happens that the central position falls on a modern field gate, so it's really difficult to find with geophysics. The north gate is in the standard woodland, that's the modern wood, so the only available one left is the east gate, and hopefully we'll be able to find that in the future. And then, you know, if we can put in an archaeological trench and prove something, then potentially we could recommend it for scheduling if there's enough archaeology remaining for it to be worth doing that. The other Roman road that we've been looking at in the area is Ricknell Street itself, what we know of as the A38. This was a major Roman road that ran through the area. In Beans Covert, which is behind, for those of you who know the area well, behind Morrison's on Wellington Road in Burton or Branston, there's a smallish stand of woodland, which had been brought to my attention 15 years ago or more, but which also was the focus of an investigation by the University of Third Age group for Burton. They've got like a sort of, they had an antiquities focused group, and they did some considerable investigation into this just before the pandemic, and were able to demonstrate this. It definitely is a Roman road. It stands about 45 centimeters high, which is about 18 inches or so above the level of the ground adjacent to it. It's got a curved top known as an agger, and the 2 ditches, which are known as fosses, one either side of the road, are still sort of just about visible in places. They've silted up very much, I'm afraid. And as you can see from the photographs, the one on the left, both of them show relatively mature trees in that area on top of the road itself. But also when we were in there, we went in to do some clearance work to clear the brambles and scrub off the road, or off the line of the road, which is about 200 meters long. What's unusual about this, so survival of Roman roads in Britain isn't entirely unusual, but what is unusual is that this section is in an urban setting in Burton. It's completely surrounded by factories, a supermarket and housing development. But just this small bit of it, which was a game covert in the 19th century, and before that was part of the Marquis of Anglesy's sort of game reserve, if you like, his sort of hunting area, has meant that this short section has survived. A friend of mine was involved with the building of the factory immediately to the east of this, and when they built that factory, so he noticed that they were digging through archaeological remains. Again, it's not scheduled, there's no protection on this road, but it would be really nice if we could show the line of the road, mark it with information boards. And then I'm also talking now to there's a group called Branston Friends who are interested in looking after the future of the road, keeping on top of the brambles and that kind of thing. What we won't do is start felling trees. Number one, that quite rightly upsets local people. They become attached to the trees. They're quite important anyway, because there's so little green space inside Burton itself. But what we might do, what's possible, not what we might do, what is possible with trees to prevent them. The worst thing that can happen is the tree stands on top of a monument and then gets blown over by the wind, and the root damage as it tears the earth away is what does the real damage to the monument itself. I mean, the roots will damage it, but the damage is already done on these images, as you can see. You know, the trees are already there. So what could happen is that the height of the trees is lowered, so that, you know, in high winds they're less likely to get caught and blown over. But what you can see there is the work that was done in beginning of November, I beg your pardon, by Burton Conservation volunteers and Transforming the Trent Valley volunteers working together to manage to get some of the road itself cleared. We're going back in January with Branston Friends to do another work day and hopefully get it cleared, and then start installing interpretation boards. On the photograph on the left there, you can see in the background there are some logs, and in the foreground actually, we were sitting on them and using them as a sort of camp area. That's where East Staffs Borough Council have been doing some woodland management. So they're not particularly targeted taking trees off the road itself, but they have been sort of thinning trees within the covert to promote sort of good health for the woodland itself. This next section I want to talk about is it's called COSMIC. This is an acronym that stands for Care of Scheduled Monuments in Cultivation. I can never remember what the plus bit is. It's sort of an extra bit that was tagged on. This is an historic England run project, and as you can see, this is for archaeology at risk. There's an at-risk register that Historic England run. As it says there, some of the most significant archaeological remains are at serious risk, and they range from prehistoric burial mounds to hill forts to all sorts of things. In the central area of the Trent Valley are some of the most nationally significant prehistoric monuments. Some of the very oldest of our prehistoric monuments are in our project area, and they are very definitely at risk. They range from some of the earliest Neolithic monuments that it's possible to find, and these are things like causewayed enclosures. These are ancient, properly ancient, 5,500 years old. There's very little to see. In fact, there's nothing to see at ground level. The eye just sees a flat field, but below the level of the field surface are the remains of these causewayed enclosures. Nobody really knows what they were. They are essentially, quite often, the one I'm thinking of is there's one at Maves in Ridware, which is sort of 3 concentric circles, but they're not full circles. They've got a causeway that leads in to the circle, so they probably weren't defensive. They were ditches with a bank on them, and they were probably used for some kind of this is the one that makes, you know, that people laugh that archaeologists always turn to, but they are probably some kind of ceremonial purpose. Now what that ceremony was, we will never know. It could have been something as simple as, you know, community events, you know, like a village fete type of event, if you like. It could have had some more mystical purpose. It could have been community events of other kinds. No one really knows. But what we can say is these monuments are properly ancient. There are very few of them left nationally. Some of the most significant ones are in our project area, and they are genuinely on their knees. They're almost gone. They're almost gone, and not all of them have any statutory protection either. I'll just talk a few moments about some of these. So this is the work we've begun. I didn't think we were going to get the project off the ground because a lot of these things are under cultivation. Therefore, we can only get onto those fields when the farmer has taken his crop off and before he sows his next one. So the work that begun at Fradley was with some trial pits to assess the state of the monument there. And then we were able to put some trial trenches along the sort of tram lines that are left by the farmers, which were just happened to run across the top of the monument. What was discovered, shockingly, was that the monument there is almost gone. It's been ploughed away, essentially. The top and bottom of it's been ploughed away, and the topsoil, all along the Trent Valley, you'll find this. The topsoil is quite sandy because it's the nature of being next to a river. And when the soil's been ploughed and the wind blows, it just blows the topsoil away. So the farmer needs to replace his topsoil somewhere. So they plough deeper, break up the subsoil, and the subsoil is where the archaeology is. They break up the subsoil, put some fertilizer in it, and they've created new plough soil. And this is one of the problems we have. You know, a lot of our monuments are recorded and then destroyed by quarrying, inadvertently destroyed by farming. And we have to find a balance somewhere between preserving our most ancient monuments and feeding ourselves and building new roads and, you know, all the things that gravel gets used for and all the things that the fields are used for. A balance needs to be found. So yeah, that's me getting off my soapbox now. So work was planned this winter at Cato, and that started. Trial pits have gone in at Cato. I've not seen the results of those yet. And there'll be trial trenches so that the pits go in away from the archaeology. And all they are is to, I'll just flick down one. Actually, while we're on Cato, I'll just talk about that, and I'll come back to the purpose of the pits in a moment. And if you can see here, this is a monument at Cato. It's difficult to see because it's under that crop. This is from an aerial photograph taken in 2010. And again, nothing to see on the ground. This is a monument. It's known as a sunburst. It's the only one like it known anywhere, which kind of makes it very special indeed. And this is one of the monuments that's under threat. It's about 4,500 to 5,000 years old, and then immediately adjacent to it in the next field, as part of the same monument, is, I don't know if you can see here, the sort of circle of pit holes. This is known as a wood henge. There's a very famous wood henge down near Stonehenge. Essentially, it's a series of concentric pits that contained tree stumps. They're about 1 meter across, and arranged in a sort of series of concentric circles. It's a large space. Essentially what that means is that it was filled with oak posts. Some of the burnt oak posts, some of the remains of those were still there in the ground when the archaeologists did the trial trenching and what have you in 2004. So this is another part of the same ancient monument. So essentially what was created was a ceremonial complex with a cursus. I'll come on to cursuses shortly. But those monuments were linked together, again, with the slightly earlier causewayed enclosures, all in a row, in a line. And it's thought that's because of the confluence of the three rivers, the Trent, the Tame, and the River Meese. An unusual confluence in itself. And this ceremonial complex probably celebrated that triple river confluence and the life-giving water and all those other things that we can speculate about. But essentially, this is importantly placed in a very particular spot for a very particular reason by our distant ancestors. What I was going to say about trial pits was that the trial pits go in avoiding the archaeology, and they are done to I'll just skip forward to this one. You can see here, this is a trial pit on the left. It's essentially, it's a 50 centimeters by 50 centimeters, and then as deep as it takes until you get to the subsoil, the natural, and that's where the archaeology is. So the top, the brown and darker brown bit is plough soil, and then the light bit at the bottom there is where you get down to the natural. I'm just going to skip back now because we're going to move downriver to Aston. Aston-on-Trent has a cursus. Again, nobody really knows what the cursus was for. The Aston one is about 1.25 miles long. You can see the sort of, in this image here, I don't know if you can just spot, there's a line that runs down there and it returns and comes back up here. These parallel lines are what cursuses look like. They were essentially a bank and ditch, or ditch and a bank. There's a break normally in them, in fact there is always a break in them that allows people in, and these were probably places that were enclosed for, again, we're going to say ceremonial purposes, because we don't really know what they were for. Originally in the 18th century, they were thought to be Roman circuses that we use for horse racing or something like that, but they're very much older. You can also see somewhere here a circle. This is a later Bronze Age burial mound. This area here, although it's very difficult to see when you're actually there, I was there last week in the field, it's slightly raised, and it is slight, but what that is the remains of a Bronze Age burial mound. That area there is, all of this area is scheduled, but that area there has been left by agreement with Hanson's, the quarrying people who own this area. That's left separately, and then it's tenanted to farmers who then farm on top of it. So that's, I'm going to call that Aston South, and then this is the next field from another aerial photograph. This was taken in 2009. You can quite clearly see, it's probably easier to see in this one than the other one, but the remains are probably in the same condition. It continues, the two lines continue there. These circles are later Bronze Age monuments, and then there's kind of a field boundary probably there, some kind of enclosure, maybe a cattle enclosure, another one just here. There's a lot going on in that area, which is why it's been scheduled. Oh yeah, the picture on the right there, that's a piece of flint. The archaeologist who was the team leader at the time, this was a great big piece of flint that he thought might have been brought in to be later worked, and it was either lost, discarded, rejected or something, and it was probably never worked. But it's quite unusual in that field. He didn't find any other bits of flint, so it was a bit of an anomaly. He didn't really know. He's just going to bag it up and tag it and let somebody else look at it, probably a flint expert. And then I just want to move on to Anchor Church. Those of you who know it will probably love it. It came into the news last year. Ed Simons is a professor of archaeology, and he'd been invited to have a look at the monument itself. It's actually a listed building instead of it's not a scheduled monument, it's a listed building. And although locally, colloquially, it was believed to be the sort of the hermitage or anchorite cell of St. Hardulf, what Professor Simons was able to bring, he's a world expert in these things, and he was able to say or to point out some of the Anglo-Saxon features in there. I met Ed on site there a couple of times because he and I were quite concerned about the graffiti and vandalism that are there. It's very sad in a way. It's a beautiful. These are photographs that I took earlier this year. Yeah, you can see in the one on the left there, just some graffiti in the background. You can see that just there. This is Himalayan balsam, which is one of those plants that's invaded, and I don't think we're ever going to be able to get rid of. But you can see the general shape. So a lot of these doorways, this is probably original, may not have been enlarged. This window probably enlarged a little bit. These ones enlarged a lot more over the years. So Anchor Church has been used over the centuries. Probably started in the Anglo-Saxon period, but then it's been used ever since. There's recordings of it was occupied by a fool with an E on the end in the, I think it's the early 17th century. It was used by the Burdett family as a kind of, in the 19th century, as a kind of picnicking site where they would go and visit. And who knows who enlarged the doorways inside, but it could have easily have been, this is inside the monument itself. The doorways were clearly enlarged at some point, potentially to accommodate the bustles that ladies wore in the 19th century, possibly for some other reason. It's difficult to say. Across the way there, looking at the picture on the left, on the right, sorry, looking out across that little backwater known as the Black Pool, you can see the Tarmac quarry. So Tarmac, Hanson's, Cemex have got quarries all along the River Trent to take out, obviously, sand and gravel. It's a shame, really, that there was no more screening was done, because it takes away something from the setting of the building itself. It is a very beautiful place. If you've never visited, I urge you to go, but not this time of year, because a lot of the public right-of-way will be underwater from flooding. Probably best to go in the summer, or the early summer or late spring, somewhere around there. This is some of the more unfortunate graffiti that's inside the monument itself, and it's very difficult to know what to do with this. At the moment, we're looking at finding ways to raise the funding to get that cleared off. I've had a local heritage specialist come in. They've got something that can probably clean this graffiti off. It's a kind of low pressure, high temperature steam that is able to remove paint from the surface. Unfortunately, the modern paint covers more ancient paint, and one of the things that Professor Simons had wanted to do was to take some paint samples, if we could get those dated. But I mean, they could date from any point, from modern to at any point in the monument's past. I don't know if you've seen Nicola. Somebody's in the waiting room. Oh, and just before we move on from this one, this image on the right, you can see a very narrow doorway there, and that, when you go in there, if you do go in there, just have a look. You can see where the hinge points and the bolts were from at some point in its lifetime. So these are the solutions that we've come up with. The monument itself is owned by the church commissioners, or owned by the church, and the church commissioners look after it. We've agreed that these are the things that we would like to do there, to put up some signage to say, immediately to say, you know, this is a listed building and there are penalties associated with damage or graffiti. Then we'd like to get the monument cleaned up, install information and interpretation boards, and then revisit the designation. What I would like to see is not only that it's a listed building which protects the building itself, but then if we can schedule it, we could probably schedule a slightly wider area so that we can also protect perhaps the spring, the hill itself that it's dug into, those kinds of things, and just give it that little bit extra form of protection if possible. And that's it, really. Cultural heritage, the future of cultural heritage. What is it? And I think that's something we all need to think about, because cultural heritage involves all of us. It's ours. It's the things that we've inherited from the past, be they the physical things that we've been talking about tonight, but it can also be less tangible things like our dialects, our folk songs, the stories that we tell ourselves about our past, and that all of that is our identity. It forms who we are, informs who we are, and how we think of ourselves. So I'd like you to have a little think about that, and maybe we can have a chat about that in a moment. So thank you very much for listening. And there we are. I'm just going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Mark. I've obviously heard you speak about some of that before, but I could sit and listen to you all night. It's so interesting, and just the sheer amount of history that's in the area that I just had no idea about. But thank you so much for sharing all of that with us. We had a couple of flurries of comments at different points. So at the point that you shared the print of Burton, so Mark says he has a copy of that print on the wall opposite me. So I was able to see that very clearly. And then Jane says, I'm watching from Scoutcliff Road in Burton, and this is a view from the water tower above my road. So that might be a good spot to try and go and get that photo if you were talking about.
Perfect. Yeah. Good idea.
And then a little bit later, Ian says, I'd love to speak to you about the proposed Roman road and the evidence for it. And I know Ian is based in Rugeley and does a lot of work around the history and heritage of Rugeley as well. So
yeah, lovely. Yeah,
I can certainly put the two of you in touch for that one.
Yeah, thank you. That'd be great.
From Mark then, in the 1990s, I photographed a full section of the road north of Beans Cover during the construction of Johnson Controls Limited.
That's perfect. Yeah, that's the one I was talking about. Yeah, thanks, Mark. If I could have a look at your photos, that'd be lovely.
We can pop our contact details in the chat box again if anybody does want to follow up with that. And then Chris has asked a question. Has HS2 discovered anything interesting yet? Have you heard as they pass Lichfield and Fradley?
Well, yeah. So another project that I'm involved in is the mitigation of some of the work that HS2 has done or will be doing as it passes through the area around Stafford. I have not heard about anything that's happened in the Lichfield area as yet. I would very much like to know because yeah, it's bound to have done. You know, as HS2 has been making its way across country, some of the finds that have come out from the course of that route have been, well, incredible, haven't they? And, you know, we've sort of watched in awe, I think, some of the Roman things, some of the prehistoric things, some of the, you know, the just pre-industrialization artifacts. But no, in answer to your question, I don't know what's happened around the Lichfield area. No.
Hopefully we will get some of that information as it comes through.
Yeah.
And then Ian, again, Catone is such an important site, and I know that you touched on Catone quite a lot in that part there. And then Chris, I can't remember exactly what point you popped this comment in, but a lot of these must have been lost in the Trent Valley due to sand and gravel extractions. I think that's when you were talking about the concentric rings and the ceremonial sites there. Yeah,
well, I have to say the Catone ceremonial complex is utterly incredible and unique. I visited there last week, and it's bordered by the A38, the farm, a quarry and railway, and then a massive Amazon warehouse. And it's just depressing. What that doesn't take away is how inspiring it is to be there, just to be in that spot and spend a moment just taking in, you know, what's really difficult in my head, at least, is that time window. You know, 5,000 years. It's a very long time, and it's almost incomprehensible. But yeah, it's a beautiful place still, despite what we've thrown at it, you know. But yes, we have destroyed all sorts of things. I know for a fact that some of the rescue archaeology, essentially, that our underrated, underpaid, overworked archaeologists discover and then have little time to write up at the end of it. So there's all this grey literature sitting somewhere waiting for us to go through it. But I know that we've destroyed burial mounds, Roman cemetery, Bronze Age cemetery, all the way down the A38 corridor, the river corridor, essentially, as we've lurched our way towards progress. I sound like I've got a chip on my shoulder, don't I?
Well, that's partly why this project, the Transform the Trent Valley project, was set up as well. It's that kind of the intersection between the industrial use of the landscape,
Very
but
much so.
the sand and gravel quarries in future will be turned back to nature a lot of the time. So what we're seeing now is a lot of destruction, but what we'll see in the future is a huge corridor of wetland, which will be fantastic for wildlife. But
that's really apparent on that Hanson site. So it was take away the historic part of it that's gone. But if you think about it, it was farmland that was essentially leaching phosphates into the river. It's been quarried out, and now it's been put back as a kind of nature reserve. Now, I've had the good fortune to be down there before it gets opened up, and I've spent quite a bit of time there, and it really is beautiful. There's all sorts going on there. There's otters, there's kingfishers, there's all manner of wildlife that just roaming freely across the site. So it's not all bad news, you know. Part of the destruction, we recreate and give over areas that are then only really suitable for wildlife. You can't do a lot else with it. It's essentially a big hole in the ground that fills up with water. If you leave it alone, you know, it will fill, you know, or the edges will fill with reeds, it'll grow willows and all manner around it. But actually what Hanson's are doing is been, you know, spending a lot of time and money landscaping that to make it wild. It's been excellent.
Right, and to let the dog out. I'm just conscious of the time. There's a couple more questions in the chat that would be good to come to. Sure. So from Mark, were the excavations done at Catome in the 1970s and 80s ever written up and published? He thinks they was done by someone at Notts Uni. Yeah,
there's a book, isn't there? There's this one. So that early stuff, I don't know if you can see, the early stuff was, this book came out, and that was based around the Anglo-Saxon stuff that was so Catome, it is 5,000 years old, but it's also been reused right up to now. You know, there's actually a farm there now, so there's a lot of Anglo-Saxon sites there, burial stuff there, houses there. So that earlier archaeology was discovering the sort of early medieval stuff, and then the stuff that was done in the 2000s was mostly targeting the prehistoric stuff. But it did look at what, you know, if it found Anglo-Saxon, it was recorded, and it's written up in a really, for an archaeologist, a book about archaeology is very readable and accessible. It's a book called Where Rivers Meet, and you know, I recommend anybody who's interested in Catome or prehistory read that book.
I'll pop that in the chat quickly as well.
Please do. Yeah. So,
question from Phil quickly: will the Pillbox exhibition be coming to Swad Library? We've actually had a bit of a chat about that today, about bringing it to Swad Lincote next year. So hopefully we'll get that exhibition into Swad next year.
Yeah, as soon as we can. Yeah.
And then for Mark, where exactly on a map did the Via Domana cross the Trent and join Ricknell Street?
Joining Ricknell Street is anybody's guess at the moment. Somewhere that's probably been built over, but it crossed the river on the Walton and Draclo boundary, and then on the west side of the river it's the Branston Lees and I think it's Dunstall boundary on the Staffordshire side, if you like. So and the boundary of those parishes follows the road perfectly. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you. Back to pillboxes. Are most pillboxes in the Trent Valley type 24s? I think they are, aren't they?
They are mostly. There are some anomalies that have popped up that my predecessor Rod had been trying to find out a bit more about, and I think they were built by railway companies. They're more of a kind of rectangular pent roof shed almost, but made of concrete. And I think they were deliberately done that to disguise the fact that they were pillboxes, because some of them are made to look like workmen's huts, that kind of thing.
And then the last one in the chat then is anyone, you might have just covered this, is anyone working on the route of the Via Divana west of the Rickdall Street and its crossing of the old Needwood Forest area? Is there anyone in the National Forest working on that?
No, but some friends of mine, researchers, have been they're long-time researchers, have been interested in the Via Divana, all of it, but essentially the bit that crosses our project area and then continues west. So yes, some work has been done on it, but it's all theoretical. So it's or desk-based, if you like. They've been out on site and looked for tracks that look like it might be, but less has been done on the Staffordshire side than on the East Midlands side, if you like. Yeah.
Great. That's all the questions from the chat then.
Excellent.
So what I've done as well is I've popped Mark's email address into the chat. It's a few messages up, so you might have to scroll up there. But if anybody wants to contact Mark about anything in this talk, follow up with anything with him, you can do that, or you can send an email to myself. You should have that through the Eventbrite page as well. I've also popped in our YouTube page, which has got our previous Trent talks on. So if you want to have a look back through there on these winter evenings, you can watch some of our previous talks there. This has been recorded. It will be put on our website and on our YouTube page. So if you want to come back and watch it again, then you'll be able to do that within the next week or so. I won't promise myself for tomorrow, but yeah, thank you very much, Mark. That's the end of our talk this evening. Really interesting. I think everybody enjoyed it based on the comments coming in. So thank you very much. Thanks everybody for joining us this evening. It's been really lovely to have you. So do keep an eye out. We might do a couple of other Trent talks throughout the winter, but hopefully